I'm going to just start off with some introductory words and then hand it off to the speakers. So welcome. This is our fourth installment of our COVID-19 governance series, where we're featuring research projects that were funded by the EGAP grant to Global South scholars who are contributing to a greater understanding of the ongoing pandemic. I'm Max Mendez-Back. I'm the Meetings and Membership Manager at EGAP, and I'm excited to have with me today Lloyd Nhodo, Hardlife Stephen Basure, Fadzai Chipato, and Josiah Taru, who will be joining us to discuss the findings of the research project, which is on the effects of the pandemic on livelihoods of informally employed persons in Zimbabwe. Just a couple housekeeping things before we get started. You have the ability to unmute yourself, but please keep yourself on mute during the presentation. If you have any questions for the presenters, we'll have a Q&A portion at the end after the presentation, but feel free to also enter your questions into the chat. If you have a question that comes up during the presentation, you can just type it into the chat and we'll get to it during that quick Q&A portion. During the Q&A, we can just do the raising hand and I can call on people who have questions. Just to let you know, this event is being recorded and will later be published on the EGAP website. So with that, let me present the speakers today. Lloyd Nhodo is the lecturer at the Great Zimbabwe University, where he teaches modules on anthropology, peace studies, and sociology. His research focuses on urban sociology, rural and urban livelihoods, human security, forced displacement, and conflict. Hardlife Stephen Basure is a lecturer in the Department of Sociology and Social Anthropology at the Great Zimbabwe University. His research interests include contemporary forms of vulnerability and social exclusion of subjugated populations. Fadzai Chipato holds a PhD in rural development and management studies from the China Agricultural University. She has done research on land governance, livelihoods, displacements, women empowerment, and poverty reduction. And finally, we have Josiah Taru with us. He's a social anthropologist whose work focuses on anthropology of Christianity broadly and on Pentecostal charismatic Christianity in particular. His previous research looks at the complex relations between a local Pentecostal charismatic movement and the post-colonial Zimbabwean state, showing the ways in which the Pentecostal movement is an infrastructural actor that plugs cracks and gaps evident in Zimbabwe's social welfare system. So thank you for sharing your presentation with us. So Lloyd, I'll hand it off to you.
Okay, Max, thank you so much for the introductions. Let me try to share the screen. Okay, is there anything?
Yep, we can see it perfectly.
Okay. I wish to start by thanking Max and the other organizers for according us the platform to present on such a momentous event. We already have the introductions. My name is Lloyd Nhodo, and with me are the co-presenters. Our topic reads, the informal economy, vulnerability and marginalization in times of pandemic, evidence from Masvingo province, Zimbabwe. I'll start with the policy challenge, and this is guided by those two objectives. The first one being to examine how the livelihoods of people employed in the informal economy changed in response to the containment measures introduced by the Zimbabwean government. The second one would be to analyze the role of social networks and local institutions in navigating the precarious conditions and vulnerabilities that came with the said pandemic in the informal sector. I'll move on to the research questions. The study was guided by those three research questions. The first one being, in what ways has the COVID-19 pandemic affected the livelihoods of people in the informal economy? The second one being, how have people in the informal economy responded to vulnerability precarity and uncertainty that came with COVID-19 containment measures. The last research question is how have policy measures dealing with the pandemic affected informal sector-based livelihoods in urban spaces of Masvingo province. I'll move on to the context of the study. The study was conducted in Masvingo province, and on the map we have the highlighted urban spaces, that is Masvingo urban, Gutu, and Chiredzi. Those are the three urban areas under study. The research focused on the implications of the COVID-19 pandemic and the government's containment measures on the livelihoods of people operating in the informal sector in Masvingo province. It should be underscored that 76% of employed Zimbabweans earn their living in the informal sector. So in terms of employment, Zimbabwe is largely dominated by the informal sector. In response to the COVID-19 pandemic and the various insecurities that it brought, the government introduced a number of measures to curb the spread of the virus. The first measure was the introduction of lockdowns, and these ranged from partial lockdowns to total lockdown, depending on the seriousness of the pandemic or infection rate. It also introduced a rigid categorization of work as essential or non-essential. And those who were in the non-essential category could not move easily. And those who were in the essential sector could move easily. It should also be noted that most of the informal traders under study fall under the non-essential sector, and this adversely affected their trade, as the findings will show. There was also mandatory vaccination for people, starting with those in the formal sector. And vaccination was very, very important in terms of mobility. And you can actually see that from the outset, people in the informal sector were marginalized in the process because emphasis was more on people in the formal sector. There were also militarized roadblocks and checkpoints. And it was very difficult for ordinary persons like people in the informal sector to pass through these checkpoints, because for one to get access to the city, you needed the letters, and the letters were not available for people operating in the informal sector. More so, like I said, they could not qualify as essential service sector. Then the research design. We used a survey, and qualitative interviews were also conducted in Masvingo Metropolitan, Chiredzi, and Gutu Urban. A questionnaire was also administered to about 1,200 respondents working in the informal sector, and an average of 400 informal sector operators in the said urban spaces. This data collection tool allowed is data collection, monitoring, progress data validation, and analysis of the results that we got. Data collection was done using the Kobo toolbox. To augment questionnaires, we also interviewed 6 key informant interviews per urban center, that is Masvingo, Chiredzi, and Gutu. Right. I'll move on to the results section. We observed that the COVID-19 containment measures adversely affected people's livelihoods. People in the informal sector's livelihoods. We observed that 79% stopped operations. And we also observed reduced income proceeds for people in the informal sector. About 62% of the respondents lamented that business was low during the lockdown. 59% of our respondents noted that they failed to operate freely, even at home, due to law enforcement officers who normally instructed them to close or even arrested them. The lockdown led to staff turnover, and 27 respondents noted that employees never returned for work after the lockdown, and this severely affected their operations, right? In as much as we observed that the COVID-19 lockdown and the containment measures introduced had adverse effect on people operating in the informal sector, we also observed that there was a window of opportunity for some traders. Therefore, some traders said the lockdown presented opportunities, and 1.3% of the respondents noted that the lockdown led to improved income and proceeds. I'll move on to livelihoods and household viability during the pandemic. Under this, we are interested in income levels before and after the lockdown. Most of our respondents were earning below $200 per month before and after the lockdown. The proportion of people earning below $200 increased from about 50% to 91.6% before and after the lockdown. After the lockdown, most of the respondents were earning below $200 per month, which points to a precarious situation and reduced livelihoods for respondents under study. I'll move on to some of the strategies that were employed by people operating in the informal sector. In our write-up, we included a number of strategies that were implemented, but of particular interest to us in this presentation, the social networks and the role of local institutions in providing protection for this vulnerable sector. So in the absence of government's assistance and inadequacy in the government's interventions, some of the respondents found assistance from non-state actors, such as non-governmental organizations. Others also got support from family members, including the extended family, faith-based organizations, and some well-wishers based on social networks. We observed that NGOs assisted 5.7% of the respondents. Of note is that respondents received financial assistance, mainly 7.84%, and food 4.65%. You can also be guided by this. Households' consumption and income showed an increasing impoverishment and livelihood disruption for the informal economy. The pandemic actually feeds into the existing trends of social exclusion for the marginalized groups of society. And this actually extended to people operating in the informal sector or informal economy. Would rather call it informal economy because the informal sector is contested. Nevertheless, the findings show a strong interplay between social capital and local institutions in building resilience for the population under study. Social capital came in a different form, ranging between bonding social capital, linking social capital, bridging social capital and linking social capital. Then we also have a different categorization of local institutions. That is civic institutions, and they go hand in hand with bonding social capital. Then linking institutions, these include the NGOs that I highlighted. They also include the business sector, and mostly they build on existing bonding social capital, at the same time linking social capital. Then we have public institutions. Here we have various government departments and ministries, and we look at how they contributed to survival for people in the informal sector. We also realized that civic institutions and bonding social capital were instrumental in getting by. That is, they were survivalists in nature, while linking social capital or private public institutions were instrumental in getting ahead under the lockdown. And this is more sustainable compared to bonding social capital and civic institutions. Our findings also demystify the commonly held view that uncertainty uncertainty does not present opportunities for vulnerable communities. Normally, the belief is that once people are vulnerable, they become passive. But we observed that uncertainty actually presented opportunities for some traders to survive. I'll move on to lessons and implications, policy implications. The pandemic and emergency responses must put the vulnerable at the core, right? Although the pandemic responses show the importance of social networks and mutual aid in the informal economy, they also review an absentee state that did not do enough to cushion citizens from adverse effects of these policy measures. We recommend the strengthening of public and private local institutions for the protection of vulnerable citizens in Zimbabwe. I thank you.
Thank you so much, Lloyd. I'll open it up now to any questions that the audience may have. So feel free to, yes, go ahead, Lloyd.
As we get to the question and answer section, I think my colleagues will be happy to assist in answering some of the questions and with us here.
Awesome, perfect. So yeah, for the folks in the audience, feel free to write your questions down either in the chat, or if you would like to unmute yourself and ask the question yourself, you can do so by raising your hand. So Lauren.
Okay, thank you so much. Yeah, Lloyd and the whole team, thank you so much. This was so interesting. I have some kind of, yeah, more substantive questions about the findings, but I guess I'd also love to know more about the process of how you actually did this research, because you interviewed a huge sample. And I'm asking this question in part because Adrian, who's also here, and I have done some phone surveys in Zimbabwe. So I'd love to hear more about, you know, how you selected people from Masvingo to participate in this process, like how you convinced them to participate, you know, how long the interviews were. I was also curious if you called people on their regular phone line or if you called them on WhatsApp. And yeah, I guess just like what the response rate was from attempts. So yeah, this is really a self-interested question. I would love to to know more about how you were able to pull this off, if you don't mind sharing.
Oh, okay. Thank you, Lauren, for the question. Maybe I'll respond to that one. As Lloyd also said, we employed the Kobo toolbox, and basically we recruited also some people who were assisting us. And if you look at the structure of the informal economy, you would see that mainly we have certain areas within the urban spaces where you find a lot of these people. So we mapped our respondents basing on those areas. For example, if you look at Masvingo, we have about 3 centers where where the informal economy activities can also be seen from. Then we also used some social networks. For example, in Masvingo, we also got hold of there is an association which is there for the informal sector people, because they've organized themselves also, and they are affiliated to a certain organization. And we went there, and those also gave us access to some of their members whom we also attract. Then you would also see that due to the lockdown, people in the informal sector relocated their activities from the stores which they frequented, and some operated front yard stores, and also some operated from the streets within the residential areas. So you would see that this also gave us an opportunity to go to those areas and interview people. So you will see that the response rate, we can say that it was almost 100%, because a research assistant would simply go and interview someone within that who is already in the informal sector. That also applies to other areas like Gutu and Chiredzi. We also made use of that same strategy, looking for key persons who could also assist us in getting access to the people who operate in the informal sector. Thank you.
Stephen, could I just ask a couple of follow-ups on that? So first of all, on the organization for informal sector, that's not Zero, is it? The organization that was set up by ZCTU in the late 90s, early 2000s? Or is it another, like, is it a national organization that organizes the informal sector?
No, it's not a national, but it's something which is localized. Like if you see that these vendors, usually they come together, the people working in the informal sector, they come together and also try to organize so that they can represent themselves to other stakeholders. For example, the council. If you also look at maybe some of the issues which okay, I think we also captured that in our write-up. You would see that the city council in Masvingo tried also to demolish and put new structures using the lockdown, because they also saw that as an opportunity where they could meet little resistance. But through that organization, most of the people operating in the informal sector were able to resist the efforts to restructure that the informal sector. So you'd see that they have their own a sort of mutual aid organization which they have created and which they use to present one front when they meet other stakeholders, and also even when they meet some problems, they can also assist each other, especially in things like bereavement. They have that local organization, but they also use that organization to feed into the broader national associations for vendors. Like I've seen, they talk about the Chamber of Small and Medium Enterprises. So they use this local body to represent themselves, maybe when other stakeholders like the Ministry of Small and Medium Enterprises also try to engage them.
Oh, if I could just say one thing in follow-up, Max, if that's okay.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know if this is in the write-up, Stephen and Lloyd and others, but it could be really interesting to think through, you know, how the selection strategy might have, you know, might I don't know, influence the results. And one thing that strikes me is that, you know, maybe people who you found on the street, you know, who are kind of, to my understanding, violating parts of the lockdown, maybe they would actually be kind of less affected, which would mean that, you know, this could be like a lower estimate of the harm the COVID-19 pandemic and lockdowns. And on the other hand, maybe people who you recruited through this mutual aid organization might be, well, yeah, I don't know, relatively shielded. So yeah, it might be useful to kind of describe, and I might be interpreting that incorrectly, but to think through like, yeah, how the recruitment strategy might lead you to get a kind of lower bound estimate or upper bound estimate of the severity. But yeah, that might be in the write-up. So yeah, I saw Nazita also had her hand up. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Lauren, for that. So we did not conduct the research during hard lockdown, but we actually conducted the research when the government it eased the lockdown. So generally, most of the people in the informal sector were out because of the relaxation of the lockdown. So we had access to different categories of people within the informal sector. Those who sell from their homes, those in the streets, and those who also use certain markets that have been established by the council. So I think in terms of being in terms of skewness or of probably picking outliers, I think we handled that well because we had access to different types of people in the informal sector when the government had opened up. But I hear your concerns, and they are quite valid, especially when we conduct research that we don't sort of pick outliers.
That's super helpful. Yeah, thank you so much for that context. That sounds, yeah, like a very rigorous sampling strategy.
Nazita?
Thanks. I just wanted to pose a question, but before I begin, I just wanted to say thank you for presenting this work. It's really a pleasure to learn from you and to see what kind of hard work has gone into creating this study and to educating us on the effects of the pandemic in this very important context. I've been thinking a lot about like the pandemic and gender outcomes, and how there's just been a number of policies that have mobilized and demobilized people in differential ways alongside gender. And as you were summing up your conclusion, I think I heard you say that uncertainty presented some mobilizing opportunities. You expected there to be passivity, but instead you observed this like really amazing mobilization of people. And I was wondering, it would be interesting to hear about the gender breakdown of that mobilization, or any sort of gender differences that you observed in your sample. And I was just curious about that. Or maybe not. Maybe you haven't looked at it.
I think
If you have any hunches, if you have any hunches as to, what may have.
I think when it's when there's 4 authors, I think they're all waiting to see who is. Lloyd, you want to take that one?
The gender dynamics in this study. Yes, we observed that the informal sector in Zimbabwe is largely dominated by women. And probably this is based on the history of the informal sector, because it's normally a strategy that is adopted by the vulnerable sections of the community, including the women. So in our findings, we clearly observed that many of the traders that were involved in informal economy were women.
And yeah, I don't know, Stephen, Josiah, or Fadzai, if you wanted to add anything to that.
In terms of gender, like Stephen said, we noticed that women comprise a huge percentage of people that were in the informal sector, which comprised about 59% of women, compared to men who were around 41%. But we didn't get further to, which I think we should have done, to check how their livelihoods are affected comparing women and men, like the gender dynamics of it. But we also looked at the composition in terms of youth. And we realized that the youth also comprised of a lot of people who occupied the informal sector compared to the older people, which showed another form of differentiation that is not gender, but another form of differentiation that we also looked at.
I'm seeing that Chipo Dendere had a question. She's unfortunately can't unmute herself, but she was asking about the that segment of the informal sector who said that they had more opportunities that came about due to the pandemic. And Chipo was wondering a little bit about what those, if you had information as to what those opportunities might have been.
Okay, thank you very much, Chipo, for that question. So in terms of opportunities that the pandemic presented for some people in the informal sector, we found out that for some traders, the pandemic forced them to diversify their business and enterprise, so they would probably venture into other areas that they had not been venturing before the pandemic. So it came with expansion of the general business. I'll give an example of a certain family that was mainly selling prepared food. And when the lockdown came, they had to look for other avenues to eke out a living. And they actually concentrated on farming. They started doing small scale farming. So we tend to see that whilst others who were not enterprising could have been forced back into home and also lost income, but for some traders or for some people, it gave them ways of diversifying their business. There are also some traders who noted that they started selling their merchandise via WhatsApp or online through WhatsApp groups that they created. So these were also opportunities that enabled them to sort of add another layer of conducting their business with their clientele via mobile app, via social media, or via online platforms. And also we saw that there was also an increase even in the uptake and usage of mobile money, because at times people could not actually meet and exchange hard cash. So we sort of see new opportunities, or we see new practice coming into play as a result of the pandemic.
Yeah, that's fascinating. We still have a little bit more time if Adrian.
Yeah, so I actually have a bunch of questions, but I'll try to limit myself. So first of all, just loved seeing the results of this project. I'll say that some of your findings dovetail fairly well with the results of our informal sector survey in Lagos on the effects of lockdown that I did with Jessica Gottlieb. I think there are a couple of things that I would love to hear more about. I loved this last answer on, like these different ways that people sort of looked for new opportunities. I imagine you have a bunch of data from the qualitative interviews. I would love to see like a lot more use of those qualitative interviews. Give us like the actual, all of the diversity in these responses. So, I have two sort of more direct questions. First was the people who didn't have to shut their shops. You got a vast majority did shut their shops for, I imagine, different periods of time. But I was surprised, given the harshness of the lockdown measures at different points in time in Zimbabwe, that there were like 20% that didn't have to shut. And so I was wondering if those people had somehow fallen under essential business and the grounds on which they fell under essential business, or if there were some people who were actually able to leverage connections or something else to circumvent the containment measures and remain open. So I'd love to hear a little bit about who you think those people are. And I guess connected to that, I would love to hear more, maybe we don't have time, but more about potential arbitrage or potential sort of profit off the lockdown kinds of businesses. And I'm thinking here of all of the previous times when there were hits to the currency regime and, you know, the sort of explosion of a black market for particular commodities like fuel or for currency. And, you know, during these periods, some people got very rich in Zimbabwe. And so I'm wondering if you saw anything in which some informal sector vendors were able to position themselves in a way where they were suddenly making a lot more profit than they had previous. And then the second question, I was struck by that slide about the fairly low levels of people who were able to access their social networks. So, I mean, some people did, but it seemed as if most people didn't actually have success with that. And that was one of the most surprising findings from our Lagos survey as well. Like, people were not able to really tap into, you know, their aid, sort of mutual aid networks, I think because everyone was hurting so much. But I would love to hear if you talk to people about why that was. Like, did they ask people and people said no? Or was there a sort of norm of everyone is hurting right now, and so we shouldn't overburden these networks? And finally, and I told you I had way too many questions. Finally, I'd love to hear more about this organization that they use for interaction with the city council, and whether any of them thought that this organization could potentially help them, or whether they sort of thought of new strategies for the organization, like to protect themselves from these kinds of government policies in future. So a lot of questions, don't expect you to answer all of them, just, you know, pick and choose.
And I'm seeing in the chat that Stephen has already started answering one, and so is Josiah. Stephen, I know you said you indicated you might be having some connectivity issues, but just wanted to check if you wanted to expand on what you put in the chat, if your internet allows. Maybe not.
Hold on, Max. You can use my PC. We are in the same room.
Oh, okay, great.
Okay, I was saying, if you look at some of the people who didn't stop operating, it's also based on the nature of the activity, the business activities which they were doing. For example, some could simply take their merchandise and continue trading even from their homes, or they could simply be playing hide and seek with the police, because you'd see that those people who mainly went to the streets were the ones who before the lockdown they had stores, but now because of the lockdown they had also to resort to going maybe to where the people are. So if you look at the structure of the informal of the lockdown, you'd see that it was easier for people to operate from the residential areas than for people to move from the residential area to the central business district. So that also enabled that small percentage to continue operating, because they could simply take their wares and start trading in the residential areas. And I think in the write-up we also mentioned some who took up other modes of trading, like hawking, where they could now employ everyone within the family. They start moving around the streets selling their wares. And I think we also observed something which is a bit on the negative side, like you would also see children being incorporated in informal trading, as they would also be used as a part and parcel of the labor force for the household. So I think that can also answer why you had we had a percentage of people being able to operate from never to shut down during the informal during the lockdown. Thank you.
So just to follow up, you don't think there was a political dimension to this where ZANU-PF vendors were allowed to break lockdown and others weren't?
Sorry, maybe I didn't get the question.
Yeah, I'm wondering, so it sounds as if we're not seeing a political dimension where those who were ZANU-PF were allowed to continue operating and others were not. It's pretty uniform. Everyone was under the same kinds of pressures on containment.
Yeah, of course, people could use different types of capital to negotiate when they run into law enforcement, and to range from political capital. You also have the usual paying of bribes, because the police usually look the other way once people pay something. That's why you would say that they never confiscated the ways of people operating from their homes. You'd also even see that even some shops could operate beyond the stipulated times, as long as they had the connections with law enforcement. So the number of illegal activities and underhand dealings which we also witnessed. And also another one is maybe just because of the difficulties in law enforcement, because you would see that these residential areas are vast, and to have people patrolling every area, it's something which is a little bit difficult. But we actually witnessed a number of occasions where you had soldiers and police chasing people from streets. But after they have gone, people simply return to where they were trading from.
Maybe in addition to what Hardlife has said, you also realize that the informal sector itself has been highly politicized. And you realize that most of the informal traders claim to be ZANU-PF supporters, because if you are not politically correct, you will not be accorded space to operate. So most of them claim to be, perhaps they become ZANU-PF during the day and opposition at night. So those are political dynamics that cannot be overlooked in informal trade in Zimbabwe.
Great, and I'm seeing that Chipo also chimed in saying that she also believes that it's a game of hide and seek mostly with the police after a period of brief shutdown. Josiah, I saw you had some answers to some of Adrian's questions as well.
Oh, yes. So I was saying, because there was lockdown and at times people could not trade freely, those who had opportunities to trade would actually take advantage of that and charge exorbitant prices for whatever they were selling. This was worsened by the fact that most people could not move freely from one place to the other because of militarized roadblocks that were imposed by the government. So at times people had to buy whatever they could get closest to their places of residence, and this probably helped some of the traders to make more profit than they would have made without lockdown. So in terms of arbitrage, in terms of making killing, yeah, there are some traders who actually saw their business growing because of high profits that they were actually making because of this artificial scarcity which the lockdown created.
We do have about 11 minutes left. Lauren, I saw you had raised your hand. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. This is so interesting. And I think, kind of similarly to Adrian, I was interested in, well, and I think Nazita as well, I was interested in understanding kind of, how the lockdowns and COVID kind of re-scrambled people's, position in the socioeconomic landscape. So some of these answers are just so fascinating, like the idea that, maybe people with longer supply chains who might have been doing better before COVID and lockdown, were possibly the hardest hit. Or, I mean, I think, we only have a limited ability to view partisan affiliation and connections to the police and things like that. But I think, some of these qualitative answers you've given have suggested that, different types of connections might have mattered. I also was wondering about, just the level of assets that people might have had. Because I guess, you're kind of painting a picture of some people benefited because they could raise prices. Some people, just had to shut down and kind of wait it out and use some of their personal assets to, continue feeding their family. Others had to pull their kids out of school. I was also wondering about things like selling assets. I guess I'm wondering if, I'm wondering if there are any other kind of dimensions, besides maybe gender and like pre-COVID wealth and, something around connectedness that you think might matter for, who might have benefited a little bit. And then on the other end, like who might have been so hard hit that their kids were out of school and they were, selling everything they had just to get by.
Okay. So in terms of such data, I think we have some graphs that are in the final report that shows probably the percentage of some households that had to dispose their assets and the types of assets that they disposed and why they were disposing those assets. But in terms of disaggregating, in terms of gender and other probably social differentiation, we did not probably go that route. But I think something that it's an oversight, that's something that we can also probably factor in as we sort of complete our report to see which households, who exactly disposed assets and who acquired assets. And also we can even juxtapose it against the type of trade or the type of business that those people are in. Because at times this also has to do with the nature of the business that you are in, whether you will become profitable or you actually, you would suspend trading and then lose assets. But we have some diagrams. I think Lloyd can actually, or Stephen can share some of those diagrams which shows disposal of assets and who was disposing and what type of assets were disposed and for what reasons they were disposed.
Thank you so much.
I think, we still have a little bit more time. So in Omange, I see you have your hand raised. Go ahead.
Oh, okay, thank you. I want to know, of course, it seems that on your findings, you presented a majority of people in Zimbabwe closed their business during the lockdown. But I want to know if you asked and you are interested to know what the strategies that they planned to use so as to recover and regain their status to come up with the business after lockdown. Thank you.
Thanks for that. Lloyd. Josiah, go ahead.
Okay, so thanks for that. So probably let me say closing maybe, I think maybe a wrong term to use. It's closing in inverted commas because of course we had a hard lockdown in which anyone who was in non-essential service was supposed to close shop, but people don't really go home and sort of stay were waiting for the lockdown to be lifted, people always find ways of trading sort of beneath the radar, or away from the state's eyes. So closing is not really the best way to describe what actually obtained in Zimbabwe. Then in terms of recapitalizing and probably refinancing their business after the lockdown, it's we different people had different strategies to recapitalize their business. Some had to dispose assets such as vehicles, home appliances. Some had to borrow from loan sharks, what is called chimbadzo here in Zimbabwe, or from some users that would actually lend them money. Some who had collateral could actually make use of banks, and also some had to start small, recapitalize by sort of starting rebuilding the business again. But we also met some traders who had some negotiations with their suppliers who would supply them stock, then they would sell that stock, pay for the stock, and keep what would remain as profit, and they would recapitalize by actually having such plans in in places. But most traders actually noted that they found it difficult to operate after the lockdown. We had some who actually failed to open, or some who didn't sort of return immediately after the lifting of the lockdown, because they'd spent both probably the capital and also some of the goods that they had, especially those who were in the food industry. They'd consumed some of the food and could not immediately start trading when the lockdown was lifted.
I also wanted to reflect more on the social networks that were used by the informal traders to deal with the many challenges that they face. In the presentation, we highlighted that one of the containment measures was the various roadblocks and checkpoints. And for you to pass through those checkpoints, you needed a letter, perhaps from the police or senior government officials. What is interesting to note is that many of the ordinary Zimbabweans, despite the fact that they were not formally employed, could have the said formal letters based on the social networks and social capital at their disposal.
Well, thank you all for joining. This has been just such a great discussion, and I really appreciate everybody for staying beyond the presentation and asking all these great questions. I just want to thank Lloyd, Stephen, Josiah, and Fadzai once more. Yeah, super interesting project. We're really glad on the part of EGAP. We're really glad to be able to support this kind of research. We'll be posting this recording of the presentation and this discussion on the website. So I'll send out an email, a follow-up email, where you'll get the recording and the link to the page on the website. But thank you, everybody, once again. Hope everybody has a good day, good evening in Zimbabwe.
Max, can I also come in?
Sure, go ahead.
On behalf of my research team, I would want to thank you and the team for the questions and contributions. Surely they will go a long way in improving our project. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much for this research. Super interesting.
Thank you.